As you may have heard, I'm not a diplomat, and I'm not a cultural expert or an academic. I'm just a student, so I'm going to try to approach you guys as a person so that you can identify with where my interest comes from and where I want to go with it in the future. When I was 17, I left the US for the first time with a Millennium Development Goals grant to Malawi, Africa, where I stayed with a friend's family in a small rural village called Kamangalire. When I was there, the project we were supposed to be working on was, we took a weekend course studying masonry, how to lay bricks, and so we were there trying to build a community center and different teacher housing. One of the days when I was there, I went for a walk by myself in the evening, and I saw some of the villagers were undoing all of the bricks that we had laid and rebuilding them themselves. And I stood there for a second, and I had no idea what to think. It completely shattered my ideas of why I was there and what I was doing. And I started speaking with them, and I came to the incredible realization that a group of several high schoolers from the US who had learned how to do masonry in 2 days had no idea how to lay bricks. In fact, the people from that village, where all of their buildings were built with those bricks, had a much better idea of how to do it, and it wasn't structurally sound the way we were building it. So I stopped doing work with that, and I spent the rest of my time there, about a month and a half, in a local school helping to teach English. And during my time there, I had a lot of really, really interesting conversations with both my friend and other people that were living in the community. And I tried to learn Chichewa, which didn't stick with me. This is about 7 years ago now. But I tried to learn, and I was really fascinated to learn that the government in Malawi actually doesn't operate under one of the local languages. It operates in English, and I was really mystified as to why. I ended up learning it was because there were so many local languages in the area that the only language people had in common was English because of the different imperial influences in the area which had arbitrarily drawn borders. I have to admit this became sort of an obsession of mine. I continued traveling, and I learned that not only in Malawi, but in lots of places all over the world, different geopolitical borders mean very little to the people that are constrained by them. It doesn't reflect the different cultures and histories of their inhabitants, but it divides and combines groups somewhat at random. This echoed a story that I was really familiar with growing up on the Native American reservation in the United States. It piqued my curiosity, and it became the basis of the last 6 years of my studies. I have not stopped my exploration of this issue. I've learned that in almost every nation in the entire world, there are examples showing that ethnicity and nationality are definitely not the same thing. There's examples everywhere: Flanders in Belgium, Chechnya in Russia, Scotland in the UK, Crimea and Ukraine, and even more so in Africa and Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Middle East, where geopolitical borders are drawn almost entirely arbitrarily by colonial powers. As Lord Jack McConnell mentioned at this conference last year, international conflict has shifted its goal from conquest and territorial expansion to ideas and identity. Although many ethnically distinct groups often exist peacefully, afforded various levels of autonomy and independent rights and self-determination, there are also cases where they erupt into violence and terrorism to express their desire for this recognition. In some cases, such as the Basque and Catalans, these different manifestations occur side by side, which leads me to the question, what conditions determine whether or not these movements will be violent? And is there any recognizable pattern between them? Through a combination of academic courses and independent travel, I've sought to amass a foundation upon which I can better understand these issues and their implications in the international community. I graduated that last year, and this was my thesis project, a synthesis of some of the information I've collected, and a stepping stone upon which I intend to continue with my projects. I hope you all can see it as an example of how your work, as politicians, as academics, as cultural experts, have inspired different students to challenge traditional academic discourse and explore new ideas and new approaches to cultural diplomacy and international relations. My fieldwork in each case began by immersing myself as much as possible in the culture of each area. I read local news publications, I tried to learn languages, and I noted cultural expressions through a variety of different advertisements, street art, public transportation, restaurants, parks, and public gatherings. This allowed me some insight into the political and social climate of each region and benchmark views of the more vocal factions in each society. It was also absolutely invaluable in determining which factions of those societies didn't have voices to start out with, which ones weren't participating in this conversation. This primary research streamlined my questions and highlighted potentially sensitive topics of discussion, which I could then choose to either focus on or avoid for my own safety, depending on the situation. I then began by identifying where I could locate interview subjects from a wide variety of backgrounds. Ethnic groups in economic situations tended to be easier, as they tend to self-stratify between particular neighborhoods of a city or regions of a country, and more often or not, were related. I spent my days conducting candid interviews with as many people as I could find, about different ethnic groups, their histories, and their significance in different societies. I chose for this project to focus on cases from the Balkans and from northern Spain, as each provided a side-by-side comparison of multiple manifestations of cultural conflict, of ethnic conflict, and allowed me to compare and contrast the differences in domestic policy approaching each one. In both cases, a new wave of ethno-nationalistic pride arose in a time where each region had undergone significant economic challenges. These cases also stand out historically, as they are all exemplary of the nationalistic movement popular within the mid-20th century, where the leaders suppressed the cultural heritage of ethnic minorities under the belief that nationalism would lead to a stronger state. There were also noteworthy patterns that emerged regarding the ages of different subjects and their stance on local social policies, which was drastically different between the older generations who actively remembered the past regimes and their reality, the middle generations who were young when they occurred, and those who were not yet alive at the time when the landmark events in question took place. Throughout my time, I kept a detailed field journal where I would record and reflect the responses of those I interviewed and note subjects for further research. Reflection and contextualization of my ethnographic research from a wide variety of other sources allowed me to produce and structure the information. I was able to isolate specific issues for comparison between religious divisions, political, economic, and social categories on domestic and international levels. My research thus operated on this framework, first synthesizing the historical and ethnographic notes, and then applying the theory and broader conclusions as to the nature and implications of ethno-nationalistic groups in the country and the international community. My first case study was in former Yugoslavia, which is an exceptional case study for ethnic identity because so much of the conflict occurred quite recently and is still continuing today. Discussing the matter with people in the area yielded really touching personal stories about individuals trying to make sense of their own identities and how they fit into the world. One man I interviewed described going to school and witnessing physical fights between Serbian and Croatian children, during which his peers asked him to take a side. They asked him which one he was. And he had no idea. He had always just been Yugoslavian. One of my Bosnian friends I spent several weeks working with in Croatia lied about his name, depending where we were traveling, and depending on the nationality of the country present, depending because he was so afraid that they would react in violent ways towards him. After spending time there and firsthand witnessing the ethnic tensions in the area, the legacy of ethnic oppression is absolutely inescapable. A basic understanding of the recent history is essential to understanding the depth and implications of the current local divisions. Arguably, this history begins with the Slavic settlement of the Balkans, which separated into different nations: Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and Macedonia. In the following years, the control over the peninsula shifted between the Byzantine, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and Turkish control, until during World War II, when the Axis troops invaded and fought for 4 years until Joseph Tito and the Communist Party took control and established the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which became the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Tito recognized the importance of each group's individuality, but the new regime also emphasized their similarities. This was extremely difficult given the diverse traditions and historical influences unique to each faction. For example, the Slovenes and the Croats' Roman Catholicism and their inclusion in the Habsburg Empire, which were much more akin to Western and Central European cultures, had higher levels of industrialization, urbanization, and general developed infrastructure. This contrasted very sharply with the Serbian, Macedonian, and Montenegrins, who had simultaneously been a part of the Ottoman Empire and were either Eastern Orthodox Christians or, in the case of the Bosnian Muslims, Sunni Islam. Yet Tito and his government placed an influence upon the common Slavic origins and language that each of those groups shared. The people were by and large connected by the new government and united by a common struggle to remove themselves from their imperially dominated past. In 1945, federalism was offered as a solution that would recognize each of the independent ethnic groups while also ensuring the power of the common state. When Tito's ideology clashed with that of the Soviet Unions, the Yugoslav government doubled their attempts to gain support at home. They liberalized their policies and decentralized significantly, and changed the constitution in 1953 to allow for autonomous control of the economy, media, and education policies. Combined with pushes for industrialization, this allowed for the most dynamic period of development in the region, with a GDP growing at 8.1% each year between 1953 and 1960. But people began resisting the government as they borrowed more and more Western capital to fund exports and increase development further. When the 1970 economic crisis struck and Tito's death followed in 1980, the governmental changes and economic condition caused the ethnic groups to question their roles even further. The collective Yugoslav identity was unsustainable. By that time, Yugoslavia disintegrated, and its population of almost 24 million ethnically identified with over 8 different types of ethnicities. Unity under Tito was only possible because the region faced a common enemy, which was economic ruin and the desire for freedom from imperial powers. This is a prime example of Charles Tilley's bellicist theory of why nationalism was so successful. When this collective identity was placed paramount to internal identities, it became a band-aid, the momentum which flowed underneath all of the issues. After the common enemy was dissolved, it was transferred internally. Suppression caused each group to be pitted against one another, the pride and passion behind each of which was so strong it was able to supersede the desire for collective success and progress. And without a mutual goal, the different factions turned on one another. As various countries allied with one another based on their shared histories, more tensions arose. The histories of each respective country and current international decisions further distance each group from one another. Historical clashes combined with tensions between the West and Russia pit Croatia against Montenegro, for example. As Montenegro has historically extremely close ties with Serbia, poor relations between Serbia and Croatia are increased. This distrust bleeds into relations between the Bosnian Muslims and the Bosnian Croatians. Kosovo, who has maintained a bitter relationship with Serbia since seceding from them, tends to side with the West, particularly with the United States, who played a large hand in their independence. But they cannot side with the Croatians because of the Croatian treatment of the Bosniak Muslims, as Kosovo is largely Islamic as well. My other case study was in northern Spain, with the Catalan and Basque cultures, who were both set apart from Spain not only for ethnic reasons, but for their economic development and success. Their roles as developed regions in a somewhat less developed state. Both the Basque and Catalan histories begin with the union of the Hispanic crowns in 1478, under which was the first Spanish state, though not still a unified nation. The Habsburg imperial system allowed for constitutional pluralism of the different Hispanic kingdoms. The establishment of Spain as a united democracy did not exist until King Philip V came to power. After a period of economic decline, autonomy of the different regions was abolished in 1716, and the government banned the institutions, laws, customs, and languages unique to each region. As the Spanish state began the process of industrialization, identity issues between the regions became points of contention. Rather than reinforce a unified Spanish identity, industrialization instead resulted in an increasing gap between Catalonia and Euskadi and the rest of Spain. For Catalonia, a geographically strategic port and the country's first steam-powered mill, both located in Barcelona, jump-started industrialization and economic success that set the region apart from the rest of Spain. For the Basque people, it was the proximity to Europe and access to steel and other such natural resources. These differences reinforce their perceived differences. With this economic success, more and more youths moved to those different cities, both in País Vasco and Catalunya. Basque nationalism emerged as a solution to the rapidly changing social, economic, and political issues in the area. The nationalist identity was defined by the chaotic combination of traditionalism and modernization, and the need to reconcile the two. Initially, Basque industrialism was dominated by a small and cohesive upper class, which benefited from a close economic relationship with Madrid. Yet industrialization also led to the establishment of a middle class and a new political ideology, which opened the door for a period of cultural rediscovery supported by the Renaissancia, which was occurring in Catalunya. The period that drastically shaped the futures of both of these regions was Franco's reign in Spain. For the Basques, this was one of the most difficult periods, as Franco had strict protectionist measures and prohibited even speaking the Basque language. These policies included a general ban on the language in all gatherings, as well as required different translations into Spanish of all Basque names in civil registries and official documents. Similarly, in Catalunya, extreme restrictions were very prevalent. Any public gatherings or activities that were associated with Catalan nationalism were banned, as was socialism, communism, or democracy. After the Civil War, the economy struggled to recover until the late 1950s. In Catalunya, like País Vasco, the period of economic and industrial growth afterwards, known as the Spanish Miracle, drew immigrants from all over Spain who were searching for jobs, making Barcelona one of the largest cities in all of Europe. Although Franco promised Spanish unity, his economic policies resulted in even more divisions between the Basque and Catalan regions of Spain. Although for the first time Madrid became a source of industrial power, the Catalan and Basque territories in particular were set even further apart from the remainder of the country by its economic success. The annual per capita incomes were, in some cases, twice as much as the rest of Spain, which solidified them as the more active and influential parts of the economy. This is where the comparison between Basque and Catalan cultural identity truly begins to diverge, and where understanding the differences and their implications becomes less based on historical factors and more based on analysis and interpretation. I propose that they diverge drastically as Franco's approach changed. As his rule wore on, restrictions in Catalonia were enforced less and less. The economy was not nearly as strong as that of the Basques, but it was stable enough to allow for another wave of cultural rediscovery, during which the language and culture were increasingly prominent in schools and daily life, resulting in a largely cohesive national identity encompassing culture and politics. After Franco's death in 1975, Catalonia adopted the democratic Spanish Constitution in 1978 and regained political and cultural autonomy of Spain. Although there are many people who still advocated for separation and/or independence entirely, their integration as an autonomous region was largely successful and peaceful. In contrast, the division between the Basques in support and opposition of Franco, coupled with the rapidly declining use of the language and increasing economic separation from the rest of Spain, isolated the Basques even more. Unlike Catalonia, It was not merely an ethnic or cultural identification that separated them anymore. Not only was it the economic situation, but it was the language that prevented people from attaining the same level of cohesion. While Catalan as a language is unique, it is still very similar to Spanish and therefore has a tie to the cultural identity of Spain as a whole in the way that the Basque language does not. Basque is one of the few languages that predates Indo-European languages entirely. It's completely unique and incredibly difficult to learn, which excluded people in a way that the Catalan language didn't, and which made the Catalan language much easier to survive in general on the whole. There was also a rift between the different social classes, as the elite had a vested interest in maintaining a good relationship with Spain as a whole. The discord would have been amplified by the relaxation of cultural and linguistic restrictions in regions like Catalonia. This likely was the crux of the divergence between the stories of Basque and Catalan nationalism, as it altered their objectives. Basque nationalism was exclusive and became defensive. It needed to center on protecting the nation from different external political, economic, and cultural forces in order to survive. They had to view themselves as a separate ethnic minority and place their identities as Basque far above their identities as Spaniards. In contrast, Catalan nationalism developed from similar ethnic and cultural roots into a more inclusive and hegemonic nationalism. This likely came as a result from more confidence in the role of Spain as a whole, and the belief that their culture could withstand the massive waves of immigration and modernization, and in fact use them to advance. Although Basque national identity has changed drastically over time, becoming peaceful in recent years, the period of exclusive corporate nationalism marks a major difference between the two different movements. Nationalism, particularly the employment of violence for nationalistic reasons, is an emotional rather than national belief. This is what makes it such a powerful force. A nation, under this lens, becomes what anthropologist Benedict Anderson calls an imagined community. Anderson sees nations as socially constructed, defining a nation as an imagined political community. Considering that technology has made transnational distribution of identities possible, people on opposite sides of the world can have the same national identity. This supports Anderson's justification for imagined communities. As he said, the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communication exists. Identity becomes a belief system. It becomes a mental anchor to a community that one does not even need to physically live in. It's the propagation of camaraderie and unity, and it's so powerful that people are willing to die in its defense. Anderson's understanding of imagined communities is also helpful as he discusses the use of media in their formation, using images to target a mass audience. These images can strengthen the memories of each group's shared history, or it can perpetuate stereotypes. But it inevitably leads each audience to choose which images and which ideas they relate to and which they separate themselves from. This strengthens the difference between different imagined communities. The Catalan example illustrates Anderson's analysis on several levels. The media in the area uses traditional festivals, the Catalan language, and the flag to promote a sense of unity between the people and the community. However, individuals have also made a conscious effort to expand this identity internationally. Despite having an extremely small landmass and population size, Catalan is one of the top 30 internet languages in use. I can open almost any app on my iPhone and read it entirely in Catalan. It's been consciously spread in order to educate people across the globe about Catalan culture and how it's distinct from Spain as a whole. Other anthropologists, such as Ernest Geller, explain this by pointing out that the nation has become the foundation for so much of the current model of social organization that it's become impossible entirely to conceptualize identity or existence outside the idea of a nation-state. The conscious construction of a national identity also closely follows with Charles Tilley's work regarding state formation. For Tilley, A common identity is constructed through what has been called the bellicist theory, or the idea that international competition, particularly war and its preparation, shape the structure of a state. He identifies war as a major factor in the centralization of nation-states. In other words, identity is based on conflict. We determine who we are by determining who we are not. Tilly emphasizes the coercive and territorial elements of the state, calling them coercion-wielding organizations. War, in this sense, becomes a coercive tool integral to establishing unification and direct power because it makes citizenship dependent on the government for safety and for the allocation of economic and natural resources. But it also allows the citizenry to define themselves in opposition to other groups. This basic understanding of nation is the foundation of understanding ethno-nationalistic movements. The dissemination of the idea of a nation is the basis for the actions of groups seeking to embody the characteristics of a nation and behaving as though they were nationalistic groups. The difference here is that the idea of a nation is based on constantly changing factors. Whether or not an ethnic group identifies as such because of primordial myths, political coercion, or a combination of the two, ethno-nationalistic groups base their imagined community on a shared culture. Furthermore, their need to function as a nation must be formed somehow. Following the discourse presented by theorists such as Anderson, Tilly, and Geller, the coercive construction of a national identity through the state cannot be all-inclusive. Media propagation of cultural symbols and common historical myths will inevitably marginalize sectors of the population, reminding minority groups of past conflict or of current social, economic, or political marginalization. The stronger the state pushes for a common national identity, the more apparent the divide between those who accept it and those who reject it becomes. The worse the national situation, the easier it becomes to scapegoat particular groups and or for certain groups to feel disillusioned at the inequality between different identities, increasing frustration and resulting in violent measures to achieve attention. This takes the current theories of national identity to a new level. Ethnic factions and heterogeneity do not make a region predisposed to violence. Political scientist David Leishan, for example, compared nations across the world statistically and found that there was no relationship between ethnic diversity and violence within countries. There are plenty of examples of peaceful multinationalistic countries. Canada and Switzerland are perfect examples of countries that have used democratization, power sharing, and increased autonomy for different regions to encourage peaceful coexistence. Ethnic heterogeneity is clearly not the cause of conflict. It appears more likely, in fact, to be caused by the statewide establishment of a common identity. The stronger the constructed identity, the easier it is to create a bellicist-based alternative to that identity. The less recognition and autonomy afforded the alternative identity, the more potent they become. The relation between nationalism and conflict appears to be dependent on the relative conception of nationalism and structural factors at play. These include unattained statehood, diaspora, low respect for minority rights, and asymmetrical ideologies. Such factors define the character of an ethno-nationalistic and bellicist identities at play. In the Balkans, the shifts in identity seem to originate from the economic and political failures during Tito's communist regime, the instability causing a social identity crisis which was expressed through nationalism. This suggests that nationalism is not merely an underlying cause, but a proximate one. Although the democratization in Tito's decentralizing reforms aimed primarily at soothing ethno-nationalism in the 1960s, it put the media in the hands of local leaderships, providing a basis for nationalist leaders in the following decades. With the fall of Tito's government, each group worried about their security for the future. No longer protected by a larger government, each group became suspicious and defensive. Unfortunately, each effort to make one's own group more secure creates insecurity for the others, decreasing overall stability. The stronger repress the weaker in order to maintain their control, and the weaker became resentful and disillusioned, understandably. People began to question, would the Croatian police protect them if they were Serbian? Would they keep their jobs if their new boss was a Bosnian? The answer was almost always no, because there was no centralized power left to enforce the ethnic bargain that existed previously. As polarization between different groups increased, it amplified the competition for different resources and increased fear and hatred between each of the groups. These sentiments justified defensive action against their enemies. This pattern is also present in one of the most famous ethno-nationalistic conflicts of recent years, the Hutu and the Tutsi War in Rwanda. This conflict was ultimately a result of colonial interference yet again. As I mentioned previously, the political borders in the area were drawn along culturally arbitrary lines by colonial powers. Initially, the citizens lived in peace, as their primary identity was based on opposing colonial power rather than against one another. This changed with the conclusion of the Cold War, when economic support from world powers decreased, causing an economic decline. This economic insecurity made different internal groups defensive, and they began to favor their own tribes and people in order to become secure. In Rwanda, the imperialists had made the Tutsis overlords, providing them with educations and jobs. When the Tutsis pushed for more and more power and independence, the imperialists shifted their sympathies to the other group, the Hutus. Both groups became defensive and suspicious of one another. When Rwanda finally achieved independence, the Hutus were in control of the government. The economic crisis of the 1980s caused each group to fight over their different resources present, which was not helped by international pressures for fair power distribution. In 1990, the Tutsi exiles from Uganda attacked the province in order to reclaim power. The Hutus, afraid of their potential retaliation, led them to massacre on a widespread level. In conclusion, if ethnic heterogeneity results in peace, political conflict, or violence in different situations, it's clear that ethnic conflict cannot be a direct result of ethnic heterogeneity. So what makes ethnic division salient enough to drive people to violence? When nationalistic theory is applied to ethno-nationalistic regions and histories, the evidence is rather compelling that conflict and violence is a result of the politicization of ethnicity. Nationalism as a form of political legitimacy, or the modernist understanding of nations in the world today, requires that ethnic boundaries do not cut across political ones. Understanding this, many of those in power seek to establish a strong national identity and unity. This either results in the establishment of multiple identities, or, if it fails, conflict based on simultaneous resentment and fear of the majoritarian or ruling parties. The ethnographic and theoretical evidence explored in this paper suggests that ethnic conflict is not, in fact, the result of diversity, but the result of insecurity. The fear and suspicion driven by the instability motivates the establishment of a secondary identity. When this identity conflates the concept of state and nation, ethnicity and diversity become politicized, drastically increasing the likelihood of violence. Thank you very much.